A homeless man walks into an upscale bank, begging for warmth, only to be humiliated and thrown out by smug, racist staff. The elite think they've won, until a massive figure rises from the shadows. Big Shaq saw everything. And now, it's payback time. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. A sharp winter wind cut through the city streets, swirling flurries of snow past towering skyscrapers and dimly lit alleyways. The morning was brutal, icy, unwelcoming, the kind that seeped into bones and made every breath burn. Outside the gleaming glass doors of Brentwood Financial, a man huddled against the cold. His clothes were tattered, his shoes barely holding together, and his hands, raw and cracked, trembled as he rubbed them together for warmth. Daniel Mercer, once a man of promise, was now invisible to the world. Life had dealt him cruel blows, loss, misfortune, a system rigged against him. He was no criminal, no con artist, just a man trying to survive. The bank was warm inside, he knew that much. If he could just step in for a few moments, escape the brutal cold, maybe even ask about a small loan to help him get back on his feet. With hesitant steps, he reached for the heavy doors and pulled one open. Inside, the atmosphere was the exact opposite of what he had left behind. Pristine marble floors, gold-trimmed pillars, and the scent of fresh coffee. Wealth practically dripped from the air. Employees in crisp suits milled about. Customers discussed investments, and the quiet hum of banking transactions filled the space. Daniel took a cautious step inside, already feeling the weight of judgment pressing down on him. He knew how this worked, knew how people looked at men like him. Still, he had to try. A woman behind the reception desk, blonde hair in a sleek bun, glanced up and immediately wrinkled her nose. Her bright red lips curled in disdain. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone making it clear she had no intention of helping. Daniel cleared his throat. Just need to warm up a bit," he said, his voice hoarse. "And maybe speak to someone about... You need to leave." The voice came from deeper inside the bank. Cold, sharp, final. Everyone turned as Carter Hensley, the branch manager, strode toward them. He was tall, impeccably dressed, his charcoal suit worth more than everything Daniel owned. A permanent smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, but there was no warmth behind it, only condescension. Daniel swallowed hard. "Sir, you need to leave," Hensley repeated, his voice louder this time, as if speaking to someone deaf or beneath him. "I just wanted to ask about... You don't belong here." A few customers turned to watch, whispering among themselves. Some chuckled, others simply ignored the scene altogether. Daniel looked around, his throat tightening. "I wasn't causing any trouble," he murmured. Hensley scoffed. "You're loitering. That's trouble enough." He turned to the security guard near the entrance. "Get him out of here." The guard, a burly man with a shaved head, wasted no time. He grabbed Daniel's arm roughly, yanking him back toward the doors. "Wait, please." The receptionist let out an exaggerated sigh. "Ugh, just throw him out already." Daniel stumbled as he was shoved forward, his worn-out shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor. The customers near the entrance moved back, as if his very presence might taint them. "Let's go," the guard growled, dragging him toward the exit. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He could already feel the warmth of the bank fading as the cold wind from outside licked at his face. Panic flared in his chest. He didn't want to go back out there. Not yet. But his protests meant nothing. With one final shove, the security guard sent him stumbling out onto the icy pavement. Laughter echoed behind him. Not loud, not obnoxious, but quiet chuckles. Like he was a joke, something to be dismissed. Daniel caught himself before he fell completely, his breath coming in ragged puffs. He turned back, watching as the glass doors swung shut. The warmth, the security, the dignity, all locked away behind them. He stood there for a moment, shoulders hunched, staring at his reflection in the glass. A man worn down by life, ignored, discarded. Inside, the staff resumed their day as if nothing had happened. Except for one man, Near the waiting area, dressed in a simple hoodie and dark jeans, a massive figure sat in silence. He had seen everything, heard everything. His jaw was tight, his dark eyes smoldering with something dangerous. Not rage, not yet, but something close. Shaquille O'Neal leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. He had come here for a simple transaction, but now he had something else in mind. The wind howled through the city streets, kicking up swirls of icy snow as Daniel Mercer staggered against the force of his own rejection. The cold air sliced through the layers of his worn-out clothes, biting at his skin as he struggled to stay on his feet. His heart pounded, not from exertion, but from humiliation. The ache in his chest wasn't just from the freezing temperature, but from the realization that he had once again been treated as less than human. Behind him, the grand doors of Brentwood Financial swung shut, sealing him out like a piece of trash tossed to the curb. Inside, warmth and privilege thrived. Outside, he was nothing more than an inconvenience. He turned, expecting to see at least one sympathetic face among the sea of pedestrians rushing past, but no one even spared him a glance. He was invisible again. "Keep walking, buddy," the security guard sneered, standing firm at the entrance with his arms crossed. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps, his hands curling into fists by his sides. "Please, I wasn't trying to cause trouble," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the bustling city noise. "Then do yourself a favor and disappear," the guard snapped. "We don't need people like you hanging around." Inside the bank, behind the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, customers went about their business. Some had witnessed the scene. Most had chosen to ignore it. A few, however, found it amusing. One of the tellers, a man in his early 30s with slicked-back hair and an expensive wristwatch, chuckled as he turned to his colleague. "Well, that's one way to take care of the homeless problem. Just make sure they freeze before they come back." His co-worker, a woman with perfectly manicured nails and a diamond necklace that screamed old money, smirked. Problem solved. Across the room, sitting in one of the leather chairs in the waiting area, Shaquille O'Neal exhaled slowly, his fingers interlocked as he watched the scene unfold. He had been here for nearly 20 minutes, waiting for his turn to meet with a financial advisor about a business investment. Now that meeting was the last thing on his mind. Hood up, head slightly lowered, Shaq remained still, his massive frame deceptively relaxed. But beneath that calm exterior, something was brewing. His jaw clenched as his gaze flickered from the tellers laughing behind their counters to the security guard standing smugly at the door. The injustice of it all gnawed at him. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was the ease with which they had done it. The way the staff had tossed the man aside as if he were nothing. The way the customers had either ignored or enjoyed the spectacle. And the way Daniel Mercer now stood outside, trembling in the cold, too broken to fight back. Shaq rose from his seat. He was done waiting. Just as he took a step toward the door, a murmur rippled through the small group of customers still watching the aftermath. A woman gasped, and someone else muttered, "Oh God." Shaq's eyes snapped back to the street. Daniel Mercer had collapsed. His body crumpled to the icy pavement, his legs giving out beneath him as exhaustion and cold overtook him. His hands barely caught his fall before his knees scraped against the unforgiving concrete. He swayed for a moment, his head tilting downward, shoulders trembling violently from the cold. And inside the bank, no one moved. No one rushed to help. A few customers glanced outside, their expressions unreadable. The tellers? Amused. One of them even scoffed, shaking his head. "Guess he got what he wanted, a place to rest," the slick-haired teller muttered. A few chuckles rippled through the staff. No urgency, no concern. Just a quiet consensus that this was the inevitable fate of men like him. Shaq's blood simmered. His lips parted slightly as he inhaled, deep and slow, as if trying to contain the growing fire in his chest. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. He had always been a man of patience, a man who knew when to speak and when to act. This was one of those moments. He adjusted his hoodie, pulled it tighter over his head, and started toward the door. The security guard saw him approaching and instantly shifted his stance, his smug confidence faltering just slightly as he recognized Shaq's massive frame. He squinted, as if trying to place the face beneath the hood, But before he could say a word, Shaq brushed past him and stepped outside into the cold. Daniel was barely conscious. His breath came in weak, uneven puffs, his fingers clutching the thin fabric of his sleeves as if that would provide any warmth. Shaq crouched down beside him, his voice calm but firm. "Hey, you still with me?" Daniel's head lifted slightly, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked a few times, confusion and exhaustion clouding his gaze. I just need a minute," he mumbled. Shaq glanced around. The people walking by still didn't stop, still didn't care. The bank employees inside? They were still watching and laughing. Daniel tried to push himself up, but his arms wobbled under his own weight. Shaq didn't hesitate. He extended a hand, steady, unwavering. "Come on, big man. Let's get you up." Daniel hesitated, his pride and shame warring inside him. But the warmth in Shaq's voice, the certainty in his presence, made it impossible to refuse. Slowly, he reached up, and the moment their hands clasped, Shaq pulled him up with ease. Daniel swayed slightly, and Shaq kept a firm grip on his arm, steadying him. "You got somewhere to go?" Daniel exhaled shakily, his gaze dropping. "Nowhere that wants me." Shaq nodded once, thoughtful. He wasn't the type to make quick promises, but he was the type to do something when he saw a wrong that needed fixing. He wasn't about to let this man disappear into the cold. He turned his head slightly, catching the reflection of the bank staff through the glass. They were still there, still watching, still whispering their little jokes. Shaq smiled. Not the kind of smile that meant amusement, but the kind that meant it's game time. He looked back at Daniel. "All right," he said, voice steady. "Stay with me for a bit. I've got some business inside." And with that, Shaq turned on his heel, his large frame blocking the wind as he strode back toward the entrance of Brentwood Financial. The security guard saw him coming and straightened his stance, a forced smile creeping onto his face. "Sir, can I help you?" Shaq pulled back his hood. And suddenly, the entire bank knew exactly who he was. Shaquille O'Neal stepped through the gleaming glass doors of Brentwood Financial, shaking off the bitter cold that clung to his hoodie. The moment he entered, the warmth of the bank wrapped around him. Heated floors, the faint aroma of expensive coffee, the quiet hum of wealth. But it wasn't just the temperature that changed. The staff did too. The same receptionist who had scrunched her nose at Daniel Mercer now straightened in her chair, her red lips curving into a well-practiced customer service smile. The security guard, who had all but thrown the homeless man onto the street, suddenly looked alert, but respectful, his earlier smugness gone. And then there was Carter Hensley. The bank manager stood near the teller counters, a man who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned a day in his life. His expensive suit was tailored to perfection, his platinum watch catching the bright overhead lights. He had barely acknowledged Shaq's entrance at first, until he really looked. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He knew who Shaquille O'Neal was. That's when the VIP treatment kicked in. "Welcome, sir," the receptionist chirped, her tone now sickeningly sweet. "How can we assist you today?" Shaq let the question hang in the air for a second longer than necessary, scanning the room, letting them sweat. The same people who had dismissed Daniel with barely a glance were now scrambling to serve him. "Just here to handle some business," Shaq said, his voice calm, measured. "Of course. Right this way, sir." She practically jumped out of her chair, grabbing a file she didn't need just to look busy. "Would you like a private suite for your transaction? We can also get you an espresso, cappuccino perhaps?" Shaq exhaled through his nose, amused. "Nah, I'm good." The manager himself took over. "Mr. O'Neal, it's an honor to have you here." He extended a hand, all polished charm. "Carter Hensley, branch manager. If you need anything at all, you just let me know." Shaq took his time before shaking the man's hand. It was a firm grip, but Shaq had shaken the hands of real men before, men who built things, who earned their place. Hensley? He was just another suit who thought power came from keeping others beneath him. "I appreciate that," Shaq said evenly. He walked toward the teller counter, slow and deliberate, eyes scanning the pristine, gold-trimmed interior. No one was laughing anymore. No snide remarks, no side glances. Just discomfort. Because powerful people got uneasy when their power wasn't being worshipped. Shaq leaned against the counter slightly, playing casual. Tell me, Hensley. This bank must bring in some serious clients. Hensley puffed up his chest, eager to brag. Only the finest, sir. Brentwood Financial is known for catering to high-net-worth individuals. We pride ourselves on exclusivity. Personalized service. Exclusivity, Shaq repeated, nodding as if impressed. Meaning, you don't deal with just anyone? Hensley chuckled. Well, we have certain standards to maintain. Shaq cocked his head as if considering it. Huh. So like, who do you keep out? Hensley smirked, as if the answer was obvious. He gestured toward the entrance with a small, dismissive wave. You saw what happened outside. That's exactly why we maintain these policies. We can't have certain elements bringing down the integrity of the establishment. Shaq's expression didn't change, but inside something sharpened. Certain elements? Hensley shrugged. No offense, but you know how it is. A place like this isn't a soup kitchen. It's a business. The tellers behind the counter shifted uncomfortably, sensing where this was going. A few employees cast wary glances at each other, but no one spoke. Shaq drummed his fingers lightly against the counter, still playing the game. So, what you're saying is, a man like that? Someone down on his luck? He glanced toward the door, where Daniel Mercer had collapsed not 10 minutes ago. You wouldn't help him? Hensley scoffed, as if the question itself was ridiculous. Come on, Mr. O'Neill. You know as well as I do, people like that, they belong on the streets. The silence that followed was thick. Shaq's fingers stopped drumming. He let the words settle in the air, let them sit, long enough for Hensley to realize that maybe, just maybe, he had messed up. Shaq turned his head slightly, taking in the room, the people still pretending not to listen. The same ones who had laughed at Daniel, the same ones who had called him filth. And then, finally, Shaq smiled. It was the kind of smile that made men nervous. Huh, he said, voice as smooth as ever. That's funny. Hensley frowned slightly. What is? Shaq turned back to face him fully, tilting his head. You didn't seem to have a problem taking my money. Hensley blinked. I don't follow. Shaq took a step closer, his presence suddenly a storm brewing in the middle of this cold, pristine bank. You just said you don't deal with certain elements. You said that man outside doesn't deserve to be here. His voice was still calm, but the weight behind it? Unmistakable. So tell me, Hensley, if I walked in here looking like him, would you have kicked me out too? Hensley froze. The silence was different now. Not discomfort, dread. The staff didn't move. The customers stared, pretending to be busy but hanging on to every word. Hensley let out a nervous chuckle, the first crack in his confidence. Mr. O'Neill, of course not, you're a valued guest, Shaq raised a brow. What? Because I got money? The question landed. Hensley's throat bobbed as he swallowed, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. I just meant... Shaq didn't let him finish. He leaned in slightly, voice dropping lower. Not loud, but heavy enough to crush the air around them. You ever wonder how a man ends up like that? He nodded toward the door. You think he just woke up one day and said, I want to be homeless? Hensley opened his mouth, then closed it. Shaq didn't blink. You ever consider the fact that the people you step over, the ones you treat like dirt, they're not lazy, they're not criminals. Sometimes life just kicks the hell out of them. The weight of his words hung in the room like a storm cloud. No one laughed now. No smug smiles. Just a bank full of people realizing that Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just here to make a deposit. He was here to make a point. And this was just the beginning. The manager, Carter Hensley, stood frozen, his once smug expression faltering as he processed what had just happened. The other employees fidgeted behind their counters, their previous laughter long forgotten. But Shaq wasn't done. He leaned in slightly, his massive frame towering over Hensley. His voice dropped lower, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the tension like a blade. So, you only help the rich? Hensley blinked, the corner of his mouth twitching as he tried to recover his composure. He let out a small, forced chuckle, and straightened his tie. "That's how the world works, buddy," he said, flashing a practiced grin, the same one he probably used on wealthy clients. "We prioritize individuals who bring value. That's just good business." Shaq let the words sit there, unblinking, his face unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. "Good to know." He exhaled through his nose, glancing around the room, making sure everyone was paying attention. "Let's test that theory." Hensley's smile faltered. "Excuse me?" Shaq reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out his phone, unlocking it with a casual swipe of his thumb. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," he said, his voice calm, even. Hensley perked up immediately. The tension in his shoulders eased, and the grin returned to his face. "Of course, Mr. O'Neill. We'd be happy to assist you. What amount were you looking to—" $10 million. The bank manager's smile froze. The employees behind the counter stopped breathing. One of the tellers, a young man with neatly combed hair, nearly dropped the stack of documents he was holding. Another teller, the woman who had mocked Daniel earlier, subtly grabbed the counter as if steadying herself. The receptionist's red lips parted slightly, and the security guard's posture went stiff. No one said a word. For a long, excruciating moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the central heating system. Hensley's jaw tensed, his fingers twitching as he forced out an awkward chuckle. "Ah, well, $10 million is, of course, a very large sum," he stammered. "We'd have to, verify a few things first." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Why?" Hensley blinked, clearly thrown off. "Well, security measures, of course. We have to follow protocol for large transactions." Shaq nodded, as if considering this. So, if I was some billionaire hedge fund guy in a three-piece suit, you'd have my money ready?" The silence in the bank stretched tighter. Hensley hesitated for half a second too long. Then he forced out another smile. "Mr. O'Neill, I assure you that's not what I meant." Shaq exhaled, shaking his head slightly. He wasn't surprised. This was exactly what he expected. The noose was tightening, and they didn't even realize it yet. He placed his phone on the counter, tapping the screen to pull up his bank app. The numbers flashed, undeniable, unarguable. A balance most people would never see in their lifetime. He turned the phone so Hensley could see it. "You need verification?" Shaq asked. "Here you go." Hensley's eyes flickered to the screen, and his mouth opened slightly, as if trying to find an excuse. Shaq tapped again, his voice deceptively light. "I can transfer the funds right now. Should I do that? Or would you rather keep making excuses?" Hensley visibly swallowed. The entire bank was watching now. Employees, customers, even the security guard near the entrance. They were all locked into this moment, watching a powerful man squirm in his own web of double standards. The receptionist, still trying to salvage the situation, cleared her throat and forced a bright, uncomfortable smile. We just need to check the cash reserves for such a high withdrawal, sir. It's just procedure." Shaq didn't look away from Hensley. "I'll wait." Hensley nodded stiffly and turned to one of his tellers, his voice tight. "Check the reserves." The teller scrambled into action, practically tripping over herself as she rushed toward the back office. Shaq let the silence stretch again, let the weight of their hypocrisy sink into the room. Then, he leaned against the counter, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. "Funny, ain't it?" Hensley's throat bobbed. "What is?" Shaq let out a small, humorless chuckle. "A man like me walks in, asks for $10 million, and suddenly y'all can't move fast enough. But a man like Daniel Mercer," he jerked his head toward the door, "steps inside just to get warm, and you throw him out like trash." No one spoke. Shaq's voice was quiet, but it carried. "I wonder. If I didn't have this money, if I wasn't Shaquille O'Neal, would you have kicked me out too?" Hensley's lips parted, but nothing came out. Shaq studied him for a long second before shaking his head, disappointed, but unsurprised. "Nah, you ain't gotta answer that. I already know." More silence. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably in her chair, glancing toward Hensley for direction. The tellers kept their heads down, pretending to be busy, but their hands were still. The young teller returned from the back office, breathless. Mr. Hensley?" His voice wavered. We don't have that much cash on hand." Hensley's expression tightened. Shaq sighed, dragging a large hand down his face. So, let me get this straight. You don't got the money, but you were still gonna try and stall me?" He let out a low chuckle. "And here I thought this was a high-class bank." Hensley's face was turning red. "Mr. O'Neill, please understand, Shaq raised a hand, stopping him. "Relax, Hensley. I don't need the cash." He tapped his phone again and slid it back into his pocket. "I just needed to see something." Hensley looked like he was about to combust. Shaq pushed off the counter, rolling his shoulders. "And now I have." He turned toward the entrance, taking a few slow steps before pausing. He glanced back at Hensley, his dark eyes holding the final blow. "You know what's crazy? Y'all were real eager to throw out a man who had nothing. But if I actually took my business somewhere else, you'd be the ones begging." With that, Shaq strode toward the exit, leaving behind a bank full of people who had just realized they had messed with the wrong man. And the noose? It was still tightening. The moment Shaq turned back toward the entrance, the air in the bank felt thicker, heavier. The tension wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was fear. A creeping, suffocating fear that Carter Hensley and his staff had just disrespected the wrong man. Shaq paused just before stepping outside. His hand lifted to his hood, fingers gripping the fabric. And then, in one smooth motion, he pulled it down. The room froze. Gasps rippled through the bank, like a shockwave tearing through the air. Wait, you're Shaquille O'Neal?" A teller's voice cracked as she practically stumbled backward against the counter. The security guard at the door, the same one who had manhandled Daniel Mercer, visibly stiffened, his face draining of color. Even some of the customers whispered in disbelief, a few reaching for their phones, blinking at their screens as if trying to process what they were seeing. But no one looked more shaken than Carter Hensley. The once smug bank manager stood rooted to the floor, his mouth opening and closing like a man gasping for air under deep water. His perfectly styled hair, his expensive watch, his tailored suit, none of it mattered anymore. He had just tried to brush off, patronize, and dismiss Shaquille freaking O'Neal. Shaq's gaze swept across the room, slow and deliberate. His towering frame, his deep, unwavering stare. It was like a storm had rolled in, and no one knew how to escape it. Hensley swallowed hard, forcing out a strained laugh, trying desperately to regain control. "Mr. O'Neill, we didn't know." Shaq's voice cut through him like a knife. "You didn't care." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Hensley flinched, his entire body going rigid. The bank staff, the customers, everyone felt it. More people were pulling out their phones now, cameras pointed directly at the scene unfolding before them. Some customers, the ones who had turned a blind eye earlier, suddenly wanted to be part of the moment. Shaq took a slow step forward, and Hensley instinctively took one back. "I got a question," Shaq said, his voice low but commanding, filling every inch of the marble-floored room. "How many others?" Hensley blinked rapidly, his mouth opening, but Shaq didn't give him a chance to respond. "How many others have you kicked out?" Shaq's voice wasn't just anger. It was disgust. "How many people have walked in here looking for help, looking for a chance, and you threw them out like trash?" A painful silence followed. Shaq's eyes locked onto Hensley like a predator watching its prey. "How many people have you judged? By their clothes, their color, their struggles?" A few murmurs rippled through the customers, some shifting uncomfortably, others looking around as if realizing, for the first time, that this was bigger than just today. Hensley's lips trembled slightly, his confidence shattered. He had no answer. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "You know what's crazy?" His voice dipped lower, almost thoughtful, but the weight of it was crushing. "I bet if I had walked in here wearing the same thing as Daniel Mercer, you'd have done the same thing to me." A nervous cough sounded somewhere in the back. The receptionist's hands twitched, her red nails clicking lightly against the desk as she clenched them together. Shaq turned, looking at each employee one by one. No one could meet his eyes. The security guard at the door, the one who had shoved Daniel like he was dirt, finally looked nervous. His hands twitched near his belt, like he wasn't sure if he should be standing at attention or finding the nearest exit. Shaq's focus swung back to Hensley, and the manager visibly flinched under the weight of his stare. "You know who I am now," Shaq said, voice calm but deadly serious. "Now let me tell you who that man outside is." Hensley's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed thickly. Shaq folded his arms across his chest. "His name is Daniel Mercer. He's not just some bum off the street. He's a man who used to have a job, a life, a future." Shaq's eyes burned into Hensley. "Until people like you took it away from him." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Even some of the tellers, the ones who had laughed at Daniel earlier, looked uneasy now. Shaq didn't blink. "You think you can tell who people are just by looking at them?" His voice dropped to a chilling calm. "You got no idea what a man's been through just 'cause his shoes are torn. 'Cause his coat's a little worn out. You think that makes him less of a person?" Hensley had nothing to say. Shaq let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I should have let this slide," he admitted. "But I can't. 'Cause see, when you let this slide, when you let people like you keep deciding who matters, that's how men like Daniel get left behind." A few customers nodded quietly, as if they were just now realizing the truth. Shaq wasn't just calling out the bank. He was calling out the whole damn system. Hensley's forehead glistened with sweat. He looked around frantically, searching for support. But there was none. Shaq finally took a step back, giving the man just enough space to breathe. But then, he threw the final, crushing blow. "You know what's funny?" Shaq's voice dipped into something dangerously smooth. "When I walked in here, y'all treated me like royalty." He let that sit for a beat. "Because you saw money." The room stilled. Shaq nodded to himself, as if piecing together the truth out loud. "But you didn't see me when I was just a regular kid, when I was just another black boy in the South, too tall, too big, and too poor. If I had walked in here back then, you'd have treated me like Daniel." Hensley's face went completely pale. The employees exchanged uneasy glances. Shaq's voice was barely above a whisper now, but it hit like a wrecking ball. "That's who you are, Hensley." He let the words settle like dust in the air. "That's what this place is." The customers weren't whispering anymore. They were watching, recording. The power had shifted, and Carter Hensley had lost. Shaq let out a slow breath, his shoulders rolling back, as if physically shaking off the disgust he felt just standing in that place. Then, with one last glance at the man who had spent the last hour trying to justify cruelty, Shaq did the one thing Hensley feared the most. He turned around and walked out. And just like that, the story left the building. But the consequences were only beginning. Shaq drove through the dimly lit streets, his mind a storm of thoughts. The warmth of Brentwood Financial was far behind him, but the sting of what had happened still clung to his skin. The image of Daniel Mercer collapsing onto the icy pavement replayed in his head, each detail sharpening his anger. This wasn't just about one man being mistreated. It was about something deeper, something rotten, and Shaq was about to find out exactly how deep it ran. His car rolled to a stop in front of a rundown shelter at the edge of the city. The building was old, its neon sign flickering, casting weak light onto the snow-covered sidewalk. Shaq stepped out, his breath fogging up in the cold, and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and damp blankets filled the air. A few people sat hunched over in corners, wrapped in donated coats, their faces lined with exhaustion and loss. The room was quiet, the only sounds the occasional cough or the rustling of blankets. Shaq spotted Daniel sitting near a small heater, his hands outstretched toward the warmth. The man looked even smaller than before, his shoulders curled inward, his face hollow with a kind of defeat Shaq recognized all too well. Shaq pulled up a chair and sat across from him. "Hey, big man." Daniel lifted his head slowly, his tired eyes registering surprise before they hardened with suspicion. "You again?" His voice was hoarse, like it had carried too many regrets. Shaq nodded. "Yeah, me again." Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "Look, man, I appreciate what you did back there, but you don't need to check up on me. This is just how life is now." Shaq studied him for a long moment. "You always lived like this?" Daniel let out a short, bitter laugh. "Nah, Believe it or not, I used to have a life. A real one. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Then what happened? Daniel hesitated. His fingers twitched against his knees. He looked down at his shoes, torn, barely holding together. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but heavy. I used to work at a bank, he said finally. Not just any bank. That bank. Shaq's eyes narrowed. Daniel let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Yeah, I was on the inside once, back when I still thought I could make a difference. Shaq said nothing, letting the man tell his story on his own terms. I wasn't just some low-level teller, Daniel continued, rubbing his hands together absent-mindedly. I was an account manager, had my own office, handled big clients, made real money. I was good at it too. Not just the numbers, the people. I actually cared about who I was helping. Shaq could hear the pride in Daniel's voice, the ghost of a man who once stood tall, who believed in what he did. But then, Daniel said, voice dropping lower, I found something I wasn't supposed to. Shaq's fists clenched. He already knew where this was going. There was fraud happening inside Brentwood Financial, Daniel murmured. Money laundering, false loan approvals, overdraft fees hitting certain accounts harder than others, mainly lower-income clients. I started digging. I wanted to report it. He shook his head. I thought I was doing the right thing. Shaq's jaw tightened. Let me guess. They didn't like that. Daniel let out another empty chuckle. Understatement of the century. His hands balled into fists. First, they tried to bribe me. Told me to keep quiet, that I'd be taken care of. When I refused, they started making my life hell, cut my hours, gave my biggest accounts to other managers, spread rumors about me screwing up transactions. Shaq's knuckles cracked as his fists clenched tighter. And then? Daniel's gaze darkened. Then they set me up. Shaq felt a slow burn rise in his chest. They pinned an embezzlement charge on me, said I was skimming money off client accounts. His jaw clenched so hard Shaq could see the tension in his temples. They had fake documents, falsified records. I had no chance. Shaq shook his head slowly, his anger boiling. And no one backed you up? Daniel let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. No one. Not my colleagues. Not my so-called friends. Even my lawyer told me to take a plea deal. He scoffed. I didn't. I fought it. Thought I could prove the truth. Shaq already knew how that had turned out. They dragged my name through the dirt, Daniel continued. I lost my job, my savings, my home. I had nothing left by the time they were done with me. Shaq exhaled, slow and measured. But inside, his rage was at a breaking point. This wasn't just about racism anymore. It was about greed, about power, about a corrupt system that destroyed anyone who refused to play its game. And Brentwood Financial? It had played its hand one too many times. Shaq's voice was low, dangerous. They took everything from you. Daniel laughed, a hollow sound. Yeah, well, that's how the world works, right? He leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. People like me, we don't get justice. Shaq sat back, processing. This wasn't just about helping a man down on his luck. This was about fixing a wrong that had been buried for too long. His voice was steady when he spoke. You ever think about getting back up? Daniel let out a tired sigh. It's been years, man. No one's giving me a second chance. Shaq's lips curled into something that almost looked like a smile, but there was nothing amused about it. Who said anything about them giving you one? Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Shaq stood, pulling out his phone. I mean, he said, dialing a number. It's time to remind Brentwood Financial that some people still fight back. Daniel sat up a little straighter. What are you doing? Shaq held up a finger as the call connected. Yeah, this is Shaquille. I need a favor. A short pause. How fast can you pull corporate records for Brentwood Financial? Daniel stared at him, realization dawning in his eyes. Shaq hung up, slipping his phone back into his pocket. You know what happens when rich people get embarrassed? Daniel shook his head slowly. Shaq's grin turned sharp. They panic. Daniel blinked. You're serious? Shaq nodded. You got thrown out because you tried to do the right thing. I think it's time to see if that bank can handle a real fight. For the first time in years, something lit up in Daniel's eyes. A flicker of hope. And as Shaq turned toward the door, he knew one thing for sure. Brentwood Financial had no idea what was coming. The sun had barely risen when the news broke. Shaquille O'Neal had acquired a significant stake in Brentwood Financial. The financial world buzzed with the unexpected move, but inside the bank's opulent walls, the atmosphere was anything but celebratory. Carter Hensley, the bank manager, paced his office, his mind racing. The events of the previous day replayed in his head: the homeless man, Shaq's confrontation, the unmasking. He had hoped the incident would blow over, but this new development shattered that illusion. The staff whispered among themselves, stealing glances at the entrance, anticipating the arrival of their new owner. The air was thick with anxiety, each employee wondering what this change meant for them. The glass door swung open, and Shaq entered, exuding an aura of authority. Gone was the casual attire. Today, he was dressed in a tailored suit that complemented his towering presence. He moved through the lobby with purpose, every eye in the room fixed on him. Hensley emerged from his office, his face pale, a forced smile stretching across his lips. "Mr. O'Neal, welcome. We're honored to have you." Shaq raised a hand, silencing him. "Save it. Gather all the employees in the conference room, now." The command left no room for argument. Hensley nodded hastily and scurried off to assemble the staff. Minutes later, the conference room was filled. Employees stood shoulder to shoulder, the tension palpable. Shaq stood at the head of the room, his gaze sweeping over the assembled group. "I won't take up much of your time," he began, his voice steady. "But there are things that need to be addressed." He locked eyes with Hensley, who shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. "Yesterday, I witnessed behavior that was not only unprofessional, but inhumane. A man came in here seeking assistance and was treated like garbage." A murmur ran through the room. Some employees looked down, guilt etched on their faces. Others glanced nervously at Hensley. "I've taken steps to ensure that this establishment reflects the values of respect and dignity. Effective immediately, anyone who played a part in yesterday's incident is terminated." Gasps echoed. Hensley's face turned ashen. "Mr. O'Neal, please, Shaq's gaze hardened. "You're at the top of that list, Hensley. Clean out your office." The manager's shoulders slumped, defeat washing over him. As the employees dispersed, a sense of renewed purpose filled the space. Shaq watched them go, determined to transform the bank into an institution of integrity and compassion. The air inside Brentwood Financial was electric. Tension clung to the walls, thick and heavy, as employees sat stiffly in the conference room, their faces pale and uncertain. The day had begun with whispers, rumors about Shaquille O'Neal's takeover, about the fate of the staff who had humiliated a man in need. Now, as Shaq stood at the head of the room, the whispers had turned into silence. He surveyed the room, his towering presence commanding attention. The people before him weren't just employees anymore. They were defendants in the court of consequences. "I could have walked away," Shaq said, his voice calm, steady. "I could have let yesterday be just another example of how people like y'all treat those you think are beneath you." He let the words sink in. "But see, I don't work like that." A few employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I don't just fix problems," Shaq continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "I make sure they don't happen again." Hensley, sitting at the far end of the room, looked as if he wanted to disappear into his chair. His suit was still crisp, but his confidence had been shredded. Shaq took a step forward. "I've seen the way this bank operates. I've heard the conversations, the attitudes, the way you pick and choose who gets treated like a human being and who gets tossed out like garbage." His voice dipped lower, but the power behind it only intensified. "And that ends today." Murmurs rippled through the room, but no one dared to speak up. Shaq's eyes locked onto Hensley. "First order of business? Leadership changes." Hensley visibly tensed. Shaq didn't even blink. "Hensley, you're fired." Gasps erupted across the conference room. The bank manager's face drained of color. His mouth opened in protest, but Shaq wasn't interested in excuses. "You made this place a home for discrimination. Shaq continued. You let your staff throw a man onto the streets like his life meant nothing, and instead of owning up to it, you doubled down. Lied to my face. He shook his head. I don't do business with cowards. Hensley scrambled. Mr. O'Neill, please, let's be reasonable. Shaq raised a hand, cutting him off. Reasonable? His tone was like ice. You didn't think twice about tossing a man into the freezing cold, but now you want reason? Hensley's mouth snapped shut. Shaq turned his attention to the rest of the employees. If you laughed, if you stood by and watched, if you helped throw that man out, you're out too. A few tellers visibly flinched. Some pleaded with their eyes, but Shaq's decision was final. This bank is gonna change, Shaq continued, his voice steady. Not just the faces behind the counter, the entire way this place operates. The employees that remained sat frozen, waiting for the final blow. Shaq let a beat of silence pass before he spoke again. And that starts with who we bring back. Confused murmurs broke out. Employees exchanged uncertain glances. Who could he possibly mean? Shaq's next words sent shockwaves through the room. I'm rehiring Daniel Mercer. Stunned silence. The name hung in the air like a revelation. Hensley looked as if he had been punched in the gut. The tellers who had laughed at Daniel the day before now looked ashamed, their gazes dropping to their laps. Shaq let the impact of his words settle before continuing. Daniel isn't coming back as a teller, though. He isn't coming back to answer to any of you. His voice deepened, carrying a sense of finality. He's coming back as an advisor. Shockwaves rolled through the staff. An advisor? Hensley's jaw practically hit the floor. Shaq nodded, crossing his arms. That's right. The man you threw out? The man you humiliated? He's going to help rewrite the policies in this bank. The tension in the room was palpable. You want to know why? Shaq continued, his voice firm. Because he's seen the worst of it. He knows what it's like to be turned away, to be treated like he doesn't matter. And that makes him the perfect person to make sure it never happens again. The employees shifted in their seats, absorbing what this meant. Shaq's gaze hardened. Some of you will stay. Some of you won't. But every single one of you is about to go through training. Real training. Not just some corporate nonsense to check a box. You're going to learn about ethics, equality, dignity. You're going to learn what it means to actually serve the community you profit from. The weight of Shaq's words settled over the room. Some employees looked humbled. Others looked panicked. But Shaq wasn't here to soothe their egos. This bank will no longer be a place where people are judged for their clothes, their background, or their skin color, he said, voice steady. From now on, we help people. All people. A beat of silence. Then, the unexpected happened. One of the younger tellers, a woman who had remained silent during the incident with Daniel, slowly stood up. She swallowed, her hands slightly unsteady, before speaking. Mr. O'Neill, she said, her voice soft but resolute. I want to say that what happened yesterday, it was wrong. She exhaled shakily. I didn't stop it. I should have. And I'm sorry. A murmur rippled through the room. Some employees nodded slowly, as if realizing, for the first time, that they had played a role in the injustice. Shaq studied her for a moment before giving a small nod. Apologies are a start, he said, but action is what matters. She nodded, her expression determined. Shaq took one last look around the room. The people in it weren't the same ones who had laughed at Daniel Mercer the day before. They weren't complacent anymore. They were reckoning with their own choices. And that was the real lesson. The morning was crisp and bright, the city humming with its usual energy. But something felt different. People weren't just going about their business. They were talking. On street corners, in coffee shops, on their phones. Did you hear? Did you see? Brentwood Financial had become the talk of the city. Videos of Shaq's confrontation with the bank staff had spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story. Social media exploded. The footage of Shaq tearing apart the bank's discrimination, of him demanding accountability, had become a movement in itself. But today, the story wasn't about Shaq anymore. Today, the story was about Daniel Mercer. Inside a small barber shop on the east side of town, clippers buzzed as they skimmed over Daniel's jawline, shearing away the rough edges of the past few years. The barber, an older man with silver streaks in his hair, worked in focused silence, shaping Daniel's beard with precision. Daniel sat still, staring at his reflection in the mirror. It had been a long time since he had really looked at himself. The man staring back was different now. Stronger. Rebuilt. He adjusted his freshly pressed suit, smoothing out the lapels. The crisp navy fabric felt foreign on his skin, but right. A tailored fit. The kind of suit he used to wear. The kind of suit he deserved to wear again. The barber stepped back, nodding with approval. That's the look of a man ready to take back what's his. Daniel exhaled slowly. He wasn't just ready. He was hungry. He stood, slipping a watch onto his wrist, then reaching for his phone. A text from Shaq blinked on the screen. Time to remind them who you are. Daniel smirked. Game time. At Brentwood Financial, the morning rush was in full swing. Customers streamed in and out, tellers processed transactions, and managers scurried from office to office. But an undercurrent of unease ran through the building. The fallout from Shaq's takeover had sent shockwaves through the bank. The former manager, Carter Hensley, was gone. His office cleaned out, his nameplate removed. Several employees who had participated in Daniel's humiliation had been terminated. The remaining staff? On edge. They had spent the last few days in mandatory ethics training, being forced to confront the ugly truth of what they had done. The atmosphere in the bank had changed. Less arrogance, more awareness. And then, he walked in. Daniel Mercer. Not as the broken man they had tossed onto the street. Not as the homeless outcast they had laughed at, but as their new boss. The click of his polished shoes against the marble floor sent shockwaves through the bank. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The tellers at the counter, the same ones who had mocked him, froze. Their faces paled as their gazes locked onto him. Daniel walked with purpose, his posture straight, exuding the quiet power of a man who had risen from the ashes. A young teller, a woman who had hesitated during the incident, stood nervously behind her station. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted some paperwork. Daniel stopped in front of the counter. His gaze locked onto hers. Her breath caught. Mr. Mercer, she stammered. He didn't speak right away, just let the weight of the moment settle. Then, his voice, smooth but firm. I remember you. She swallowed hard. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I should have said something. I should have done something. A long pause. Then, to her shock, Daniel nodded. You should have, he agreed. But now you have a second chance. Relief flooded her face. A few other employees who had remained silent during the incident shifted, looking away, realizing that they weren't all getting the same grace. Daniel turned toward the rest of the staff, his eyes sweeping across the room. The power dynamic had shifted. They weren't in charge anymore. He was, and they knew it. Shaq sat in a corner near the lobby, watching it all unfold with a satisfied smile. He had done what he came to do. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been rewritten. His phone buzzed. A text from one of his business partners. The board wants a statement. You want to say something official? Shaq glanced at Daniel, standing tall in the center of the bank, shaking hands with a young man who had just walked in looking nervous. Probably another customer who would have been dismissed before. Shaq smirked. He had said everything that needed to be said, but he had one last thing to leave them with. He texted back, we all fall, but we don't all get the chance to rise again. If you're in a position to help, do it. Mic drop. Fade to black. Injustice happens every day. But will you stand by? Or will you stand up? Shaq used his power to make a difference, and now it's your turn. Share this story, spark the conversation, and be the change. Because sometimes all it takes is one person to rewrite the rules. Who will you stand up for today?